Maganda umaga, or good morning, everyone. Well, maybe I should say magandang tanghali. It's closer to noon. Today's video is about setting up a WordPress development environment. If you've ever managed or maintained a WordPress site, you will understand the value of having an offline environment to test and evaluate changes before applying them to the actual live site. This environment will be run on Linux, Windows, or Mac, the host OS as it's called. It will require virtualization to support this. So yeah, your hardware needs to support that. We will be using Oracle VirtualBox, which is a Type 2 hypervisor, and our virtual server or guest will be running Debian 12, though probably pretty much any Linux server distribution should work. Our focus will be on setting up the virtual server. This will be similar across all platforms, since we'll be working mainly in VirtualBox with that. We'll not be covering the installation of VirtualBox, as this process varies depending on the OS that you are running, your host OS that is. For the record, I am using Arch Linux as my host system. We will use freely available and downloadable resources from online for this project. Performance will be dependent on the hardware, so making some assumptions here. You have virtualization support turned on in your BIOS/UEFI/RAM, or I should say /firmware. 8+ gigs of RAM. You could do this with less, but I would recommend at least that much. Multi-core processor, you're definitely going to need multiple cores, 4+, I would think. 20+ gigs of free drive space. If you have all that, you should be ready to go for this tutorial. So I'm also going to assume that VirtualBox is already installed and running. And yes, I know VirtualBox is a Type 2 hypervisor, has several disadvantages, and will be controversial with some folks. That should, however, be weighed against the convenience. To be perfectly frank, I install VirtualBox and it just works. And I'm using this on a laptop, and I'm going to be moving around with it because I'm going to be traveling in another month or two, and I had issues in the past with setting up Type 1 hypervisors on this laptop. We will build a Debian 12 based virtual machine, meaning no initial GUI. It'll be very fast and responsive, even on underpowered hardware. We will then convert it to a LAMP server, and I will explain later in the video exactly what LAMP means. At that point, we will add a Light GUI to make things a bit more user-friendly. We want the server to be a development environment where we can do pretty much anything we need to work on our WordPress site. In this video, we'll set up the virtual environment. This should not take more than 50 or 60 minutes. After that, in the next video, we will install WordPress and its dependencies, and it does have some dependencies. And finally, after that, my first project in this new virtual environment will be to construct a WordPress block theme. In the past, I have strictly used classic themes, so I want to put some time into understanding block themes and how to develop and use them, as they seem to be the future of WordPress. Okay, let's talk about our WordPress environment first. There's a lot of advantages to having a local WordPress environment. You can design and build in a non-live environment, identify various issues on a non-live server. You never lived until you've had an issue on a live server and you're trying to figure out how to correct it. Test new mods and themes in an environment you control. Avoid extended maintenance periods and downtime for your website. And once you have your plugins, your themes, your changes all mapped out, made, and working properly, you can save the changes and they can be quickly replicated to the live site. So yeah, there are a lot of advantages for having a local WordPress environment. Now, there's some options for this too. There's actually some programs out there, Studio and Local. There's a few others. These are local development environments for WordPress. There might be a limit on what operating systems these run on. I haven't actually used them. I've read about them. Then there's also the XAMPP, WAMP, MAMP. These are all versions of XAMPP, which is setting up a local server on your computer, or you can even set this up on a USB stick. The issue here is if you set this up on a Windows machine, say on a USB stick, you need to plug it into another Windows USB for it to work, it won't work on a Mac or Linux, for example. And same if you set up Linux, it'll work on Linux, but not on Windows. What we're going to do is we're going to set up a virtual server. For virtual servers, this could be virtual machine, a Docker container, a pod, a Linux container. There's a lot of ways you can virtualize. We're going to be using a virtual machine here. Our virtual machine is going to consist of several programs to work with WordPress. First off, web server, it's Apache, Nginx, etc. We're going to be using Apache. Database, you're going to need MySQL, MariaSQL, etc. There's several out there. We'll be using MariaSQL. And the server-side programming language. Now, there are a lot of server-side programming languages out there, but hate to say it, WordPress uses PHP, so that's your server-side programming language. So my preferred solution, and again, I talked about the LAMP server earlier. We're going to use VirtualBox, a Debian LAMP server, and LAMP stands for Linux, Apache, MariaDB, used to stand for MySQL, and then PHP. So let's jump over to the WordPress site. This is, we're looking into the hosting handbook and server environment on the WordPress.org site. This will give you a list of the WordPress requirements. You can scroll through. There's a lot of them. You can read them. We'll talk about these a little later. There's also the VirtualBox site where you can download and install VirtualBox. Again, Windows, Mac OS, Linux, Solaris. You may or may not want the VirtualBox extensions. There's also something called guest extensions, which usually comes with VirtualBox, but we're probably not going to be using them this time around. And then finally, we have the Debian site where we can download the net install CD for Debian at this address. Those are the programs we're basically going to need. Everything else will go from there. Just a quick note here. I recorded this last segment, then I went back and looked at the VirtualBox website, and it's changed. So here's the new website, what it looks like. Same stuff's available, but it's definitely got a new layout. And I was really surprised when I went back to it. And so I thought I'd I got to stick this in to make sure people know the website looks different than what I portrayed it as originally. All right, let's talk hardware requirements here. So first, we're going to need hardware to run VirtualBox, and for that, you're going to need virtualization support, either VTX or AMDV. This will be in your UEFI firmware or your BIOS, where you have to turn this on. And then you're going to need sufficient resources to run both your host, VirtualBox, and your guests. So VirtualBox recommends dual core or better CPUs. Higher the core count, the better. A minimum of 2 gigabytes of RAM, 4 gigabytes recommended. Again, the more the better. A minimum of 10 gigabytes of storage space, 20 gigabytes recommended. And again, the more the better. VirtualBox, again, runs on Mac, Linux, runs on Windows, Linux, Mac OS as a host system. Now, as far as Debian 12 bookworm hardware requirements, almost any processor Debian does recommend if you're running a desktop, you have at least a 1 gigahertz Pentium 4. RAM recommendations, no desktop system, 256 gigabytes recommended, 512 or more. Desktop system, 1 gigabyte, minimum recommended 2 gigs or above. Storage space, 2 gigabytes, recommended 10 gigabytes. So very light hardware requirements for the Debian installation. But you need to add those to the VirtualBox and what your actual operating system uses to come up with your total requirements. All right, let's go ahead and get our Debian install set up. So we're going to fire up VirtualBox, and then we're going to select a new VM. We're going to give it a name, something we can remember later on. If we don't like the default folder VirtualBox assigns, we can change that. We can go ahead and add an ISO file for the Debian 12, which you should have downloaded, the net install one. And we're going to skip unattended installation, and then next. Here we're going to set the memory and the CPU cores. The red, you don't want to venture into the red here. That means you'll be taking away from the host OS. So we want to stay in the green. I've got plenty of memory and CPU cores, so we're going to go with 8 gigs of memory for the VM and 4 cores. And we're also going to select EFI for the boot mode. Then next. And we're going to go ahead and do a 40 gigabyte Storage drive, note this will not take up 40 gigabytes on your hard drive. It will grow as we add stuff to it. That's just the maximum size it's going to grow to. Then we say, okay, we review the information and finish. I want to open settings because the easiest thing to do here, because I want to access the machine from both external to my laptop and from my laptop. We want to change our network adapter to bridge instead of NAT. And we, just to be on the safe side, we want to pick one of the Intel CPU emulation or Intel network emulations. Doesn't matter which one, but I've had better luck using Intel than the PCNet ones. Next, we want to go ahead and write some stuff in our description about what we're doing. We know what this is. I tend to clone these machines between steps so I can just delete if I have problems and go back to a cloned image, but you want to write down here in description what you've installed and when you've installed it, or whatever notes you need to help you identify this particular virtual machine, as well as the name. All right, once we get everything set up the way we want, we can go ahead and start the actual install by selecting the start. We're going to come to the Debian 12 install screen. Now, instead of hitting install here, since this is VirtualBox, there's an issue with Debian 12 and frame buffers. So we want to hit the E key, and then we want to make a modification and add FB equals false for frame buffer equals false, and then hit F10 to continue. And then we'll go through the normal install. We'll let the network auto configure, because since we'll be moving around the different networks, you're going to get different IP addresses for this. So we don't want to fix it. If we ever settle down someplace, we might need to go to a static IP address. But for now, we'll leave it dynamic. Going to give it a host name. If you hit go back at the host name, it'll take you back and let you manually configure the network, but we're not going to worry about that at this point. And then domain, you can pretty much do what you want here as long as it's not going to be attached to the internet, but I do have an internet domain I use for these things, so that's what I'm using here. There's all sorts of arguments about using localhost and stuff like that, but I just get a domain for $1 a month for this one, and so $12 a year, and I just use it. Now on the root, if you don't enter a root password, the Debian installer will install sudo and set sudo up for your regular user. But I like having a root account, in spite of what some people say, so I'm going to go ahead and do a root password, and then create my regular user, give them a password, and then we wait for some system installation stuff to happen. Well, no, we wait for some components to be, so then we wait for some components to be loaded. After that, we come to the format your storage drive. I'm going to do that. Basically, I'm going to go with the auto options and just verify what it's created before I go ahead and say yes to format the hard disk. After that, it will start downloading stuff from the internet. So when you finish with your Debian install, you'll have the latest software. We don't have any other resources to scan, so everything's coming from the internet, no other CDs or anything, so we say no here. Pick a mirror, and then wait for the install to finish up. Well, the base install to finish up anyways. Then we get to task select, where we're going to choose or where we want this to be. I'm going to disable desktop and GNOME and basically everything except for common system utilities, so we just have a base Debian install to work with. After this, you'll install the bootloader, which is grub. And once everything's done, we can go ahead and reboot. Okay, I know I ran through that quite fast, but I've got other videos on this channel for installing Debian you could look at. I'll have to go back and see if I can link a couple of them, or at least one of them. and maybe put a title block up in the corner, or put a web address, put an address up in the corner someplace. Anyway, moving forward, we're going to shut down our virtual machine, and then I'm going to basically clone it so I have a clone of the base install that I can use here or for other projects. I'm going to do a full clone and give it a different name, and done. So now we have a clone of the base install. If we screw something up, which happens quite a lot with me anyways, I can delete that and just reclone the clone and start from fresh. All right, we got our machine fired up again, and we're going to log in. And I'm going to do something a little different here. I'm going to log in as a regular user, and I'm going to use SU-TAC-L to switch over to root. The L option in SU treats it as a login, so you have all your paths set up correctly. Enter the root password. And now you'll see in my command prompt is changed to root instead of RT. I can go ahead and install sudo and open SSH server so we can remote into this machine when we want to. Once installed, I double check the with vi sudo to check that the sudo group is active. And then I add sudo to, with mod, user mod -a capital G, I add sudo to my username. And then we'll check our IP address as long as we're here so we know what to use later on. We'll do that before we reboot. All right, the next thing I want to do is check my SSH access. So we'll start PuTTY, and we'll set up our connection with our IP address. And we should get something about the SSH key. We'll accept. And then we can go ahead and log in as RT in SSH. In Debian, by default, root login is disabled. Now we've got access, and because we installed the SSH server, we can use secure copy and some other things to move data back and forth when we need to. But we just wanted to make sure this worked. We're at the point now where we want to install the actual software to make a LAMP server. And I think I said it before, I'll say it again. LAMP is short for Linux, Apache, MariaDB, PHP. If you take all the first letters, they spell LAMP. Back in the day, LAMP was MySQL, but now you can use MariaDB if you want. But anyway, as mentioned, the primary packages to install is first Debian 12 Bookworm. That's done. We just did that. Then we're going to want to install the Apache web server, Apache 2. Don't worry, we're going to go through all this stuff at the command line just so we make sure we get it right. And then you want to install the MariaDB server. A lot of tutorials, if you watch them, will tell you also to install MariaDB client, but that's automatically installed with the server, so you don't have to do that. And then again, like I said, PHP is the language used by WordPress, so that you got to install that. So Apache will never talk to MariaDB, but they have to talk through PHP. So to connect Apache 2 to PHP, we need the libapache2 mod plugin. And to talk between MariaDB and PHP, we need the PHP-MySQL. It's kind of funny. MariaDB and MySQL use the same PHP plugin, but yeah, that's the way it is. I should mention Maria is a fork of MySQL. Anyway, once we get all these installed, we're going to do a little bit of testing before we move on. First, on our guest, we'll run IPA to get the IP address. So the first thing we're going to do after we get the IP address, we're going to point our browser at the IP address. Within the directory variable /www/html is a file called index. That's what's going to be displayed when we point our browser at the IP address. And this will show that Apache is working. It'll give you some information about Apache and Debian. Then we're going to create a file we're going to call info.php in the same variable www/html folder. And an example below, we're going to point our host browser at the IP address /info.php, and this will show us that PHP is working. And you'll see what I'm talking about shortly here. But this will basically verify that our LAMP server is working properly. All right, let's jump back into the command line and let's go ahead and do this. So since we're logged in here as RT instead of root, we're going to need to use sudo apt install, and again, packages Apache 2, MariaDB server, PHP, PHP MySQL, and libapache 2 mod PHP. Hit return, enter our password, and let it install. You'll notice here you can see the Maria client, the MariaDB client is being installed here. I just wanted to point out that I said it earlier, but yeah. And once this is installed, that should be it. Our LAMP server should be pretty much ready to go. We just need to give it a test. So now that's installed, we need to test it. So first we need to make sure of our IP address. So in our guest, let's check the IP address with IPA, and we can see it right here. Then we can jump over to our host and fire up a web browser. And then let's just enter the IP address. And this is the default page, the index.html page that tells you about Apache 2 and Debian defaults. So we can look at that here. And this is the page here, and it'll show you all the little HTML you don't want to know, but this is what's you're seeing displayed when we go to this address. All right, the next thing we want to test is whether PHP works. So we're going to need to jump back to our guest and go sudo vi, and we want to create the file info.php. This will create an empty file. We're already in our www/HTML directory. So again, we want a left arrow, question mark, PHP space, PHP info, brackets, semicolon, question mark, right arrow. And that's it. We'll save this. See it's there. And you see exactly what we types in it. So let's go ahead and repoint our browser by going to /php.info, or excuse me, /info.php. And this is the page we get, which tells us some information about our PHP installation, but more importantly, proves that it's working. All right. Everything looks good so far. Okay, everybody, this is where we get a little bit outside of the comfort zone with the server. I'm going to actually put a GUI on here so that we can make it more of a development environment rather than just a server. So we want a lightweight GUI. I'm going to install Xorg instead of Wayland because Xorg works better with a lot of the light window managers than Wayland does. There's very few window managers that work perfectly with Wayland. For a window manager, I'm planning on using JWM, or Joe's Window Manager. This is a lightweight window manager that does sport a taskbar and a start menu, so it'll pretty much do what we need it to do. It's not as full featured as a full desktop, but we can get by with it. And we're going to go to PCMan File Manager, or PCMan FM as a file manager. This is a GDK-based file manager. It's fairly light and fairly fast. And then Genie is our final program we're going to install, which is a text editor that'll help us. You'll see when we run it, but it's gonna, if you ever use Notepad++ under Windows, it's similar. Now, I'm not going to install a display manager / login manager. I would normally install Slim, but the Debian version of Slim is old and has some issues. And well, there is a version Slim fork which is used by Arch, which is more up to date. So, but I was thinking about maybe installing XDM, but I don't really want to get into X resources and any of that fun stuff with y'all. So we're going to skip the display manager and we'll just log in from the command line. Other additional programs that come with the Xorg program are the Xterm, Xcalc, Xman's a manual, Xmanual viewer is a graphical manual viewer, Xcalc is a scientific calculator, Xmore, it's a graphical text reader. Then there's the Xclock, which is an analog clock, and then there's something called Xeyes, which basically puts a window up with a couple of eyeballs in there that stare at your cursor. It's just a sort of for fun stuff. Some other stuff in there too, but most of it, you're probably not going to have a occasion to use. I do wish to note that in this case, I am not going to be doing a lot of configuration with the X environment, at least not here in this tutorial. I'll probably do some configuration at some point just to make it easier to use. If anybody's really interested in a full-on tutorial about how to configure JWM, please let me know. Now, because we've installed a window manager and a graphical environment, we're going to log in through the VirtualBox interface rather than through SSH, because you can see the graphical environment here. Here's our terminal, which is Xterm. Let's check our screen size and set it. All right, let's check a couple things here. First, since we're using a GUI, I want to go back into settings and I want to boost my video memory, max it out. Like I say, I've updated what I've installed, and let's go ahead and start up again. We go to 1920 by 1080, view in full screen mode, and this should be just like we're using the desktop on our regular computer, except this is a VM. Here's the Pac-Man file manager, and this is Genie, and you can see how all this is. You can see how Genie does the code and things. It's got some convenient features. But this, again, just a basic GUI to make our development environment a little more user-friendly. I mean, technically, we can do everything from the command line. And I probably will do some configuration before the next video in this series. But again, this is not about configuration of JWM or any of the Xorg or X resources. If you have questions or you want a video on that, let me know. I'd be more than happy to do it. Okay, that's about it for this segment. I think I got what I wanted to accomplish. We created our virtual environment for our WordPress server, along with some tools for making it a development environment. Next time around, we're going to install WordPress along with this. There's several other dependencies that we need to install before WordPress will run. It's kind of interesting. WordPress has some required dependencies and it's got some optional dependencies, but having done this in the past, you pretty much want to install all the dependencies, or some of your WordPress stuff just may not work right. So it's best to install all the dependencies, and we'll go over that in the next video. That actually probably won't take too long to do, but once we get a WordPress set up, we can then look at getting into developing a block theme, which again, my previous experience with WordPress has all been classical themes, but I want to get into the block theme because less and less are they using classical themes out there. So anyway, that's it for this video. So please subscribe, like, comment, and like I say, if you want an actual detailed explanation of configuring JWM, which I'm going to probably do some configuration before the next video, so it'll probably look a little different, but let me know if you want a video on that. I mean, the configuration of JWM or Joe's Window Manager is ridiculously easy to do. So, like I say, just let me know. Anyway, until next time.